Hello and welcome to my presentation on the cultural accommodation of a business letter. My name is David Whitehead and this video is for the subject of intercultural pragmatics. I divided my presentation into 4 sections. First of all, I will be discussing the visible features of the original business letter of introduction. After that, I will talk about the invisible dimensions, and in particular Edward T. Hals's dimensions and the way in which these apply to the original version of the business letter of introduction. And following that, I'll do the same with Hofstede's dimensions. Finally, I will discuss the result of this project and my final version of the business letter of introduction. First of all, I've extracted the most obvious visible features we can find in the letter at first sight. With a first reading, we can see that it is extremely unorganized. In what sense? Well, we can find many different chunks of text, of information, that don't seem to be connected in any particular way, which makes it slightly difficult for the reader to understand what the text is about and what it's trying to say. It is also very wordy, and I'll show you in a second how at first glance it looks like a wall of text and it contains way too many words for a business letter of introduction. As I mentioned, there are approximately 350. And finally, it uses very poetic language, which is probably not the most appropriate language for a business letter of introduction. And it uses many metaphors and comparisons, as you'll see in a second. So here it is, the original version. As I mentioned, and as you can see here, at first sight it looks difficult to read. It's very long, and it looks a little bit of a mess. Now, I'll try to describe this version of the letter in terms of the invisible dimensions provided by T. Hals. We could say that it is polychronic in the sense that it talks about many different things without focusing on one thing in particular, which makes it difficult to follow. In terms of contact, we can easily see that it belongs to a close contact culture, since the writer establishes a very close relationship between himself and the receiver, as well as the customers of his company. And finally, we can say that it clearly belongs to a high context culture, since the letter is very implicit. As a reader, one can only assume what it is about, since there is no purpose stated. Now, moving on to Hofstede's dimensions, I have selected the 4 which I find more relevant in terms of this letter, and of course the ones which we discussed in class. The first one would be power distance. Now, in the original version, we have sort of a combination. Since in the Spanish version they use the usted form, which is utilized to show respect, but at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, the writer establishes a very close relationship between himself and the receiver and his customers. Therefore, that's why I say we have a combination of power distance. Now, it would be collectivist as opposed to individualistic, in the sense that the writer keeps referring to himself as a group, as the company, as we, our products, etc. Whereas in an American context, we would expect to find more use of the first person pronoun singular, I. It is feminine as opposed to masculine, in the sense that it uses very poetic and expressive language. And finally, we can see that it has high tolerance for the unknown, since, as I've already mentioned, it doesn't mention the purpose, so one has to figure out what the text is about, which is in very high contrast with what we would expect in an American business context. Now I'll proceed to discuss my version of the business letter and the changes I've made. As you can see, at first sight, I've removed a lot of words, approximately 150. So this makes it much easier and much more reader-friendly. That is after I've added a purpose. So as you can see in the first two lines, I clearly state with a performative verb, introduce, what the purpose of the letter is. Now, another obvious change I've made is that I've corrected the language. Since the original version had been translated into English using Google Translator, there were many mistakes which needed to be corrected. So I edited to make sure that it was written in proper English. Now, I've also omitted all forms of expressivity and poetic language to accommodate it to an American context, as I mentioned earlier. And I've established a higher power distance hierarchy relationship between the writer and the receiver. And finally, I've reorganized all the information that the letter provided to establish a coherent structure. So to do this, first of all, I state the purpose, as I mentioned, clearly, explicit and concise. From the get-go, the reader knows exactly what the letter is about. After that, I include a line which describes what the goal of the company is. Following that, there is a paragraph dedicated to an explanation of the situation of the company. After that, there's a paragraph to describe the way in which they work. And to finish off, there's a respectful farewell section. So I'll briefly go through a couple of examples of the ways in which I have changed the letter. In terms of power distance, as I mentioned already, I've omitted the expressive language and the close relationship between the writer and their customers. So this reference, we welcome any suggestion from our customers, is simply being deleted. In terms of individualism, instead of referring to the company as a group, I've made higher use of the first person pronoun singular I. So rather than saying, give us the opportunity to meet you, I've written, I hope that you feel we can do business together. And finally, in terms of masculinity, I've removed that expressive and poetic language we were talking about. So instead of saying, we all know that success is a secret hidden inside a casket, I've simply written, we ensure the quality of every detail. As you can see, this is very concise and much more straightforward and appropriate to the American business context. So, that's all from me. Here are the references I used. Of course, the article we've read in class. And thank you for your attention. Should you have any questions, here are my contact details.